Sicily's prehistory is as vast as it is fascinating. From cave dwellings to rich hoards of ceramics, the island offers up fine rewards for those wanting to trace its path. Usually located off the beaten track, journeying to Sicily's prehistoric sites is often a pleasure in itself. And on arrival, the visitor will usually have the place to themselves. So I hope that gives you some idea of why I think it's worthwhile dedicating a whole hour to prehistoric Sicily. Simply because many of the sites that we're going to look at today are just beautiful sites in their own, and they're worth going to admire the natural beauty as much as the archaeology. And in fact, I'm going to offer an apology here because I'm not a trained or professional archaeologist by any standard. And even with the dates, with the numbers, I mean, once I get beyond 800 BC, they are really just numbers to me. So please take things a little bit with a pinch of salt. I'll do my best. But as I say, I'm not a trained archaeologist in any sense. So what we're going to do today, what I thought we'd do is I've chosen 4 or 5 nice archaeological sites from around different parts of Sicily, and I'm just going to give you a general overview of each of the sites. And I'm going to start in the most distant past and move slowly towards the present, but it's only in a very general sense organized in that way, but to give us some idea of time, if you like. So let's make a start, and I'm going to begin with this creature here. Now, any of you who have traveled with us to Sicily, to Siracusa anyway, and who has been to the fabulous Archaeological Museum will remember this little fellow, because I always like to start off a visit at the museum with this. And you will recognise exactly who it is. It is a dwarf elephant, a pygmy elephant. It has a fabulous Latin name, which I'm completely unable to pronounce. It's something like, I'll have a go at it, Paleogeology nadriensis. Now that's completely wrong, but it gives you some idea of how complicated it is. And it was found in a cave near Syracuse, a cave by the name of Spinagallo. It's not unique either to Sicily or to the Mediterranean. There are quite a few examples in Sicily. There was one found in a cave on the north coast of Sicily, San Teodoro. There are some that have been found in Sardinia, in Malta, and also in some of the Greek islands. It dates from the late Pleistocene. Now, if you're anyone like me, you'll struggle to place when the late Pleistocene is, but just to jog your memory, it is between 129,000 and 11,700 years ago. So basically a jolly long time ago. And the important point about this skeleton is it is testimony to the fact that a long time ago, elephants wandered around Sicily, and indeed others of the Mediterranean islands. Now, herein lies the geological puzzle, and historians, geologists, and so forth have long argued over the ancient, deep, what we call paleogeology of the Mediterranean. In fact, some geologists argue that once upon a time there wasn't even a sea there at all, and it was only the opening of the Straits of Gibraltar and the sea coming in from the Atlantic that filled the Mediterranean. I'm not quite so convinced by that argument. I think there always was a sea there. But I think people will agree that the sea was never the same shape as it is today. But that doesn't need to detain us for now. The thing that is important is that during the Ice Age, the sea level of the Mediterranean was certainly much lower. And beneath the seabed, hidden beneath the surface of the sea, on the seabed, are many volcanoes around the Mediterranean. And with the lower level of the sea, it's very probable that at some time in the past, it was possible to walk between North Africa, in particular what's modern day Tunisia, and Sicily, and indeed also Malta. I mean, this is the explanation that's given for the presence of those fabulous temples on Malta, those of you that have seen those. But at some time, again in the distant past, obviously the sea level rose and that land bridge or that causeway disappeared. Nevertheless, these pygmy elephants, dwarf elephants, whatever you want to call them, continued to roam around the islands of Sicily, Malta, Sardinia, and so forth, at least for a further period of time. Whether or not they corresponded with human beings, Homo sapiens, we don't really know. That's another matter of conjecture, a matter of argument. So this skeleton that was found in the cave of Spinagallo, we don't know. It was because it was hunted and that was why it was in the cave, or was because it was living there and just sheltering there. But before I leave our elephant and move on, I want to remind you of a little story that we mentioned a couple of weeks ago when we were at the Villa del Casale looking at the fabulous Roman mosaics. And you will remember this slide here, which is a depiction of Ulysses. He's been captured by Polyphemus, the Cyclops, and kept captive in this cave. And you'll remember that the Cyclops was that legendary figure that had the single eye in his forehead. Now, this is only conjecture, but it's quite possible that if you were an ancient farmer digging away in your field and you dug up a skull of one of these pachyderms, one of these elephants, couldn't you imagine that it belonged to an ancient and primitive giant with a single eye in the middle of their skull? It's quite possible, isn't it, that this is the origin of the legend of the Cyclops. I like to think so. I have to say, a couple of years ago, I was taking a group around the museum in Siracusa, and they were a group of archaeologists, amongst whom was the emeritus professor of archaeology from the University of Newcastle. And as I told that story, I could see him nodding his head. And at the end of it, he said, no, he said, that's not true. So it might not be true, but I think it's a nice story, and it's one of these things that gets passed on. So anyway, let's now go forward in time, and we're going to go to the Egadi Islands. We met the Egadi Islands a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about the Phoenicians. Do you remember we went to visit the island of Mozia? And I mentioned the Battle of the Egadi Islands in the First Punic Wars. Well, today I want to take you to the island of Levenso, which is one of these three Egadi Islands. It's not the most remote. The prize for that goes to Marettimo, nor is it the most popular with holiday makers. That one is Favignana. But Levenso, and I've got a picture of it here, is really a very beautiful island. There's not a great deal there. There is just about this village or a few houses around the port. But really the reason why people go there is the beautiful sea. And you can see from this picture here, it really is a fabulous colour. And in fact, there's a scuba diving school in the Egadi Islands. They all go off diving, whatever else. Anyway, the other thing that there is on Levenso is a cave. The Grotta Genovese is it's called. Grotta is the Italian word for cave. And it's found on the other side of the island. So the island's very small. It's only about a couple of miles from one side to the other. Can be a very nice walk, but what we usually do is there's a very good local guide with his jeep who gives us a lift across the island, and we end up in this place. In fact, that might even be you, Chris, stooping to take the photograph there. This is one of our groups from the Easter trip a couple of years ago, and the Grotta Genovese is down a slightly steep footpath at the bottom of this cliff here. It's about a 20-minute walk down. So we walk down, and the guide then opens the gate to the cave. It's locked up for obvious reasons, and we have to duck down. And inside, of course, it's pitch black, and we're not allowed to take photographs. We're not allowed to take videos or shine lights, God forbid, or anything like that. So there's only the light of the guide, and at the end of it, if we behave very well, he lets us take one photograph. But inside this cave are the most, or should I say, is the most extraordinary cave art in the Mediterranean. It equals certainly the cave paintings of Lascaux. The only difference is that here we can actually go and visit it. We can get right up close to it. So the cave art comprises 33 engravings and 100 little painted figures. The engravings date back to the late Paleolithic age, which is the Old Stone Age, which is about 25,000 years ago. So they are just about as old as any art that we have anywhere in Europe. The paintings are a little bit newer. The paintings date from about 15,000 years ago. Unfortunately, I don't have any photographs of the engravings, but I do have a couple of photographs of the, in inverted commas, paintings. You'll see that they're black figures. I mean, they're all monochrome. They're not multicolored in any way whatsoever. And this particular set is, we think, depicting hunters. That's what these creatures here are. But this figure in the middle is very interesting. Nobody's absolutely sure what it depicts, but we think that it could well depict, if you like, an earth goddess, Mother Earth, if you like. Certainly the cult of the Earth Mother was prevalent in the Mediterranean from a very, very early age, and it's quite probable that it even goes back to 15,000 years ago. Quite possible, absolutely. Other sets of figures are such as these, where you can see animals that they are hunting, animals and fish. So this one here, I agree, it looks rather like a dolphin. I think it's more likely to be a tuna fish, because this is the area where tuna is prevalent. We have some sort of bovine animal here, a cow, something like that, and another four-legged animal here, probably another cow, is what it is. There are also elsewhere, there's a depiction of a deer, and a bull, a horse, and possibly also somebody believes that they've identified a cat. So the discovery of these paintings is quite extraordinary. They were discovered relatively recently, in 1949, by a painter from Florence, a woman by the name of Francesco Minellano, who was just here on holiday, and she'd heard these local stories about this cave, and she was intrigued, and she was the one who went in and found them. But one of the big questions that this throws up is, what on earth were Stone Age men and women doing on a little island of Levenso, catching bulls, horses, deer, and so on? Well, the answer is, of course, that at that time the sea level would have been much lower, and Levenso wouldn't have been an island. It would have been joined to the rest of the west of Sicily. And between the island of Levenso and Favignana is a very deep rift, actually. And the method of hunting was a very simple one, very primitive. It was simply to drive these animals off the edge of a cliff, and they'd tumble down, break some bones, break some legs, and the hunters would then be able to come and capture them, kill them, and then skin them and eat them. So, primitive method, but it obviously was entirely effective. Nevertheless, an astonishing, I think it's an astonishing cave to imagine that it's there off on an island off the west of Sicily, in one of the most remote corners of Europe. I want now to move forward in time and take you to some more islands. This time we're going to go to the Aeolian Islands off the northeast coast of Sicily. There are 7 islands in total, all of which are volcanic. Some of them are indeed active volcanoes even today. So Stromboli, Ginostra, by the way, is the name of the village. It's not the island. Stromboli is the village, of course, continuously active. Vulcano is also another active volcano. And the others are extinct volcanoes. And therein lies the clue to why they hold an interest for us in terms of archaeology, because the rock of these islands is, of course, volcanic rock. And we're going to go and find out something rather special about that in a moment. We're going to go and visit 3 islands. First one we'll visit is Lipari, second one is Philippi, and the third one is Panarea. So first of all, let's go to Lipari. It is as I said, an extinct volcano. And in fact, when you go and stay on Lipari, it doesn't really even look like a volcano in any way, unlike some of the others, which are very obviously conical. Lipari is not at all. And one of the big industries in the past, up until relatively few years ago, up until the 1990s, when the Aeolian Islands became part of the UNESCO framework, and unfortunately they were required as part of that to cease the operations, was the quarrying of pumice, because much of the west of Lipari, you can see how almost the entire side of this mountain is pumice. Now, pumice, of course, as you'll know, is a volcanic rock. Of course, it's a very light rock. Just to remind us, it's the rock that you use in the bath for rubbing off layers of dead skin. And of course, pumice is just simply a product of the volcano. It's part of the lava and that spews out of the volcano in the time of an eruption. But one of the extraordinary things I always find, and I really find this hard to believe, actually, I'm not a geologist, so I don't know how it could possibly work, but there is another rock with exactly the same chemical composition as pumice, and that is obsidian. And obsidian couldn't be more different to touch, because it's not light, it's not white, but it's black, it's heavy, and it's very, very hard. And dotted around Lipari are, you still find these rocks, these examples of obsidian. As I said, it has exactly the same chemical composition as pumice. The only difference, I gather, is the temperature at which it is thrown out of the volcano during the eruption. And one of the very interesting things is, unfortunately, I haven't got a photo. This is all obsidian, this particular rock. But in some places in Lipari, you will find veins of, alternate veins of obsidian and pumice, which I think is absolutely extraordinary. And of course, once you break off a chunk of obsidian, you get something like this, which is an example from the museum in Lipari. And in the Stone Age, this was the only way of producing a sharp edge in the Mediterranean. If you think about it, in Britain, we talk about flints, don't we? Knapping flints to make flint axe heads and so forth. But in the Mediterranean, there is no flint, it doesn't exist. So the only geological substance that they had was obsidian. And the richest source of obsidian in the Mediterranean was the island of Lipari. And this goes a long way to explaining why the Aeolian Islands were a centre for trade going right back to the Stone Age. Now, I think it's worth saying at this point, so pieces of obsidian from Lipari have been found all around the Mediterranean. That's not to say that one person carried the piece of obsidian from, I don't know, from Lipari to the Peloponnese or something. I don't think that ever happened. I think it was passed through a series of hands, a series of transactions, through various barterings, one person to another, to eventually end up in wherever else it did. So I think it's important to bear that in mind, the system of trade. But nevertheless, the important point is that Lipari was the source of this obsidian right back in the Stone Age. We're going to go to another island now. We're going to go to the island of Philippi, which is one of the more remote islands. You see this lovely terracing up the hillsides here. This isn't actually terribly ancient. In fact, this was probably abandoned only about 100 years ago. But the part of Philippi that is very ancient is this little plateau or platform here, which is known as Capo Graziano, or more correctly, the whole of this cape is Capo Graziano. But Capo Graziano is also the name of the village. It's also the name of the people who inhabited it. And in the early Bronze Age, so let's put a date to this, the early Bronze Age is sometime between 2300 BC and 1500 BC. People were making little villages here. They were building huts side by side, quite close together, you'll see. So each of these huts would have housed, we think, a family. I've got another photo here, a little bit easier to see how they were made. So they were oval in form. You'll see that they have really quite thick walls. They have a kind of mortar. I mean, well, this is modern mortar on top to have held them in place. But there was something there that was holding them in place, even back in Bronze Age times. They would have stood about 6 feet tall, and then on top would have been a thatched roof. And as I was putting these slides together, I realized that this is actually my son here. So it gives you some idea of the size of these huts. So another village very similar to this on Filicudi is a Bronze Age village on Panarea. This one actually post-dates the one at Cabo Graziano and dates from the late Bronze Age. So in other words, sometimes between 1300 BC and 800 BC. And very similar kind of thing, these ovaloid huts here. But the difference is you'll see that they built the village on this isthmus, and the only way of reaching it was across this very narrow causeway. Of course, this is a modern path that's been put in recently to allow visitors to go there. But certainly back in the Bronze Age, there would have been just this little causeway to get across onto almost, if you like, it's almost an island. So very easily defensible. Here's another shot that I have of it to show you a little bit about more of how it would have worked. But what's extraordinary about, I didn't tell you the name of this place. This place is called Calaiunco. And what's extraordinary about the site of Calaiunco is that we have found some pottery there. And this is now in the museum in Lipari. And this pottery is Mycenaean pottery. In other words, this is showing evidence of trade between the Aeolian Islands and the Mycenaean people, Bronze Age Greeks, if you like, on the Greek mainland. Again, same thing. I don't think it's because somebody got in a boat and rowed all the way from the Peloponnese and brought this vase to the Aeolian Islands. I don't think that happened. It would have passed through a number of hands to arrive here. But nevertheless, evidence of trade throughout the Mediterranean going back to the Bronze Age. Before we leave the Aeolian Islands, I want to go back to Lipari and to, this is Lipari Town. So Lipari Town on the island of Lipari, it's the main town on the island. It's known as Lipari Town. And what we're looking at here is, well, in the time of the Greeks, it would have been the Acropolis. And then since the Greeks, in Byzantine times, Norman times, it was a castle. You can see the fortifications. These fortifications date from even later, from the Spanish times. But you can also see this beautiful church on top, which in origins is Norman. There is a beautiful Norman, what's it called? I want to say crypt, but it's not a crypt. Peristyle inside there. And then some later dated churches round about. But the origins of this go back much further than that. And unfortunately, I apologize, I haven't got terribly good photographs of these, but nevertheless, they're as good as I've got, and it gives you some idea of the layers of history that are beneath all of this. So I'm going to take you on a little walk up to the castle, to this area here, which is nowadays the Archaeological Museum. to just about here and show you, we're going to look into the ground just about there. And this is what we see. Now, okay, not terribly exciting in some ways, but you can see that it has been labelled, and you can also see that it's been built up in many layers. Now, each layer is a testament to a people that lived there, a new generation, a new period of time when people lived there. And you can see, so this is very much one of those oval Bronze Age huts, just like the ones we saw on Panarea and on Philippi. But you could also see things even deeper down than that, and you can see things built on top of it. So what is extraordinary here now, this is not a good photograph at all. It's a photograph of a ceramic tablet which explains what that is, but it does give you some idea. This is a cross section, if you look at this. So the top layer in grey is obviously the most recent layer of history, and the bottom layer in green is the oldest. And the bottom layer in green is the Capo Graziano, in other words, the late Bronze Age. The grey is the Hellenistic layer, so in other words, dating from around 200 BC. So in other words, we've got 2,000 years of history here in this photograph. And so the grey, you can just see some straight lines here. This is actually a Hellenistic road. You can see, as I pointed out before, the green, the oval huts of the early Bronze Age, but we've also got some late Bronze Age, and we've also got some Greek. So sorry, I can't think. It's difficult to make it all out, but nevertheless, you get the idea. So who would have thought on this remote island, Aeolian island off the coast of Sicily, you're looking at here 2,000 years of prehistory, and that's before you even get to 0 AD, the birth of Christ. I think it's absolutely extraordinary how rich prehistory is in Sicily. I'm going to go back to the Sicilian mainland now. And before I go on to the last site that I want to visit, I want to mention the three peoples that we are very often talked about when we're talking about Sicilian prehistory. The names of these people are actually written in the Greek names. I'm not quite sure why, but anyway. So this map, you'll see this has got various archaeological sites on it, dotted from around Sicily. And the three prehistoric peoples, you can see that they populated the east of Sicily, the west of Sicily, and somewhere here in the middle. Now, the ones in the west, we have actually mentioned them earlier on in our talks, because if you cast your minds back, you'll remember the fabulous temple of Segesta. And I told you that Segesta was inhabited by the Elymians, or Elimi, as they're written here in the Greek. Now, the Elymians, we don't really know a great deal about them, and we have very little archaeological evidence of them. But we do have, it's actually Virgil who is where we get most of our evidence from in the Aeneid. And he tells us that they were refugees from the Battle of Troy, led by Aeneas. They settled in originally what is now Tunis, And on their way to Rome, remember that Aeneas was the legendary founder of Rome, they stopped off in Sicily and founded a couple of other places here, Erice and Segesta. But as I say, the only real evidence we have of them is literary. It's not archaeological. The other people, the Sicani, or the Sicans is the way that we usually refer to them, inhabited the western side of Sicily, the centre of the west. We think that probably they came from what is nowadays the Iberian Peninsula. And it's supposed that the divide between these two people was actually a river that flows north-south here in the southern part of Sicily. It's actually the river Salso, and therein lies the clue. It's a slightly saline river, the water flowing over salty rocks. It absorbs the salt from the rocks as it flows. But the most important, I think, nobody would dispute it, the most important of these three peoples are the Siceli, or the sickles, because of course that's where Sicily or Sicilia gets its name. So they are the origin of the name of the island. We think that in origin they were probably an Italian or Italic tribe who journeyed down the Italian peninsula at some time, crossed the Straits of Messina into the east of Sicily. And their heartland, as you can see, most of their sites were down here in the southeast of Sicily. And there's a reason for that, because this area here, you can't tell from my map, but it is a mountainous area, not mountains as in the Alps or in, they're not sort of pointed mountains, but it's high land going up to around 1,000 meters, is the Iblion Mountains. It's basically a high limestone plateau, but gouged through with these fabulous gorges created by these rivers. You might be able to see in the map, there are some rivers that traverse this high plateau. And it's quite an extraordinary landscape. We're going to go and look at it in a minute. Remember, of course, that back in prehistoric times, Sicily would have been very, very thickly forested. So it would have been very difficult moving around in the interior of Sicily in those times. And the site that I want to take you to, where we're going to finish our talk, is the site of Pantalica, which lies west of Syracuse. I don't know if you can see on this map, but there is a river that starts west of Pantalica, flows through Pantalica and flows out into the sea just south of Syracuse. That river is the river Anapo. Now, we're going to go and visit Pantalica. Before I show you some photographs of Pantalica itself, actually quite a good introduction to it is, dare I say, Google Earth, because this gives you an idea of the landscape. This is this high limestone plateau. You can see it's cast limestone, scoured through with these very deep gorges. This here is the valley of the river Anapo, flowing towards Syracuse, is somewhere down here. This is the valley of the river Calcinara, and just here is the confluence between the Anapo and the Calcinara. And here is a tributary that flows into the Calcinara. And Pantalica, ignore that, that's in the wrong place. Pantalica is here. So it's surrounded by these two valleys. But more than that. So I've got a couple more photos. If we zoom in, you'll see that it is entirely surrounded by these deep gorges, so that it is actually almost an island, a bit like Calcinara on Panarea that we saw earlier. This here is the palace on the top. Just another photo. So here we are looking from the south now. So this Siracusa is in this direction. The river Anapo flowing down towards Siracusa that way. This is all the valley of the river Anapo. This is the valley of the river Calcinara. This is the tributary, and this is the drawbridge, which is it's not a real drawbridge. I mean, it's a kind of metaphorical drawbridge, if you like. But this is the only access to all of this island here. Just one final picture. So now here we are. This is looking from. This is nowadays a modern road, but this is the drawbridge, and you can see just how narrow and how the land falls away in a great cliff either side of it. And this is absolutely the only access to all of this land. So this was the Sickle heartland. If you like, it was a Sickle fortress. It was a perfectly natural fortress, absolutely impossible to get to unless you knew that this was the only route in. And I think I mentioned back in the very first lecture when we started to talk about the Greeks, the Corinthians arriving in Siracusa, and we asked who was here in Sicily before the Greeks. Well, the answer is the Sickles. And for sure, the arrival of the Greeks rather, pushed the Sickles back into their heartlands, back into places like Pantalica. I got some, these are photos of Pantalica now. And you'll see it's very, very remote and very beautiful. And you have to imagine that in Bronze Age times, it would have been even more thickly forested than now. This photo is taken from what I call the drawbridge, that area there, looking down on the valley. This is something extraordinary. You can see this white line here. This is actually a disused railway line. This wasn't I can assure you that. This is a railway line that was built in the 19th century to go and get minerals, and also there's some tanning factories up in there, and bring them down to Siracusa. It was abandoned in the middle of the 20th century and now is a beautiful footpath that you can walk along. In fact, Tina, you will remember this, Tina and Albert, you've done this, you've walked this with us, and at times it goes through some fantastic tunnels. So it's really a great experience. This is another part of Pantalica. So you'll see this is Pantalica, and this is the river Calcinara. And look just how steep, absolutely impossible for any invader. On the top of Pantalica, I told you that this is the if you like, the palace. We don't really know about that. I mean, people call it the palace. There's really very little left. And archaeologists really argue about what there is left and what its function is. It's not terribly exciting, I'm afraid. If you go and walk up there, you're really left scratching your head as to what it is. But the real prize of visiting Pantalica is this, which is extraordinary. So this is more scenery. This is just beneath the what I call the drawbridge. If you look carefully, look, can you see these little black rectangles? Yes? Lots and lots of them. And the more you look, the more you see. They look like windows of houses. And you think they're sort of houses for goblins or something like that. Not at all. They're not windows at all. They are doors. And they're not doors to houses, but they are doors to tombs. And there are literally thousands of these things around Pantalica. We don't know exactly how many because nobody's counted all of them, but we think around 4,000. Some of them are quite small. Some of them are just large enough for 2 or 3 bodies. Others of them are the size of a small room, and it could quite easily accommodate 6 or 7 people inside. They were excavated in the beginning of the 20th century by a Sicilian archaeologist, Paolo Orsi, and the things that he found in them were taken to the museum in Syracuse. I think it's true to say that, unfortunately, relatively few things were found in them because they would have had, it would have been a wooden door on the outside, not a stone door, I don't think, which of course subsequently fell away or fell into disrepair even, and subsequent generations, even in antiquity, would have looted these tombs for whatever they could have found there. So relatively little what was found in there. But nevertheless, as one of our guests shows, you can actually climb inside them and make yourself at home if you like. That's the kind of size they are. But extraordinary amount of work for burying people. I mean, the other point that is obviously often made is that obviously these people had to do something with the dead, and there was no soil around. And actually, this rock is relatively soft. It's relatively easy to dig, and digging into the soil was a good solution as much as digging into earth. But quite an extraordinary site. It's very difficult to get to Pantalica. It's quite off the beaten track. But if you do go to Sicily, I completely recommend a visit to Pantalica. It's one of the extraordinary sites on the island. So I think that's pretty much is all that I have to say. So I will stop sharing my screen, and if any of you have any questions, do feel free to wave your hand, shout out, and pipe up.
Damien, I just want to apologise for being unmuted. I muted myself to start off with, and
it didn't disturb us at all, Kate. Don't worry.
I'm so sorry.
You were very quiet, so don't
oh, I'm very, very sorry.
It does seem to do that. It does seem to unmute itself somehow. I've noticed that. I don't know how it does it, but
Damien.
Yes.
Damien,
Tina. Ah, yes. Oh, who's got a question? Sorry.
When Clinton does it, he just mutes everybody, and it works.
Wave your.
I was going to ask you, Damien.
Yes, Robert.
You remember? Oh, sorry.
Oh, Hazel. Yes,
Right.
Hazel, you got a question. Yes.
Well, just a comment, really, that at Agrigentum they had hollowed out the walls. Do you remember, for tombs?
Absolutely.
Just
yes.
copying
Yes.
sort of Pantalica in a way.
Yes, you're right, Hazel. Absolutely. Now, of course, it's something that they did all the way through this region because it was actually something that was very easy to do.
You don't have much soil.
The ones that we saw in Agrigento post-date these ones. They are from
of course.
the Byzantine time.
It's a similar ritual. It's a similar
exactly
way.
the same
if you
process.
don't have much soil to dig, what do? You carve out the rock.
Yes, exactly. Yes, that's right. And in fact, Hazel, you reminded me. Last year I was in Agrigento, and there was a tour guide there, a very cheeky tour guide, and he said, I tell the German tourists, he says, I tell them that this is a tomb with a view, and you pay extra for this tomb. I thought it was a very nice way to. Somebody else, yes, Robert, sorry.
Okay.
It's actually Rosemary.
Rosemary,
Damien,
sorry.
a little bit more on this Sicily. Did they eventually just assimilate with the groups that came in, or did they get wiped out, or what happened?
Yes, they did assimilate. Quite to how, we don't really know. I mean, one of the theories that is put forward is that the great richness of the Greeks was based on enslaving these sickles. So to start off with, many of the sickles would have been taken as slaves by the Greeks, but then they would have eventually acquired their own freedom, intermarried with the Greeks, and absolutely, so they would have mingled in this way. But you're absolutely right, because DNA tests have shown that the modern Sicilian population actually carries quite a large amount of this sickle DNA, as we found in sickle bones and so on that were found in these tombs. It's the same DNA that's gone all the way through. So good question there. Thank you. Anybody else?
Damien?
Tina, yes.
I remember at the top we saw the Byzantine church and one of the sort of larger caves at the top. And I can't quite remember how far back, I don't know if you remember off the top of your head how far back that dated.
Yes, absolutely. So Pantalica wasn't completely abandoned by the sickles, and it was continuously inhabited all the way through antiquity. But in the Byzantine times, in the early Christian times, Paleo-Christian, so we're talking 300s, 400s, up to the 500s, it coincided with the arrival of marauders into what is nowadays Cappadocia in Turkey. And a lot of those early Christians left Asia Minor, they left Turkey, and they escaped to Greece and also Sicily. And they came to live in remote places. And so that was when they went to live in places like Pantalica. There are a few other places around Sicily like that. There's a couple of places in Ispica as well. But Pantalica was one of their places of choice. And you're absolutely right. So there are some Byzantine churches there, but they date from later. They date from 500, 600 AD. So they post-date the tombs by about 1,000, 1,200 years, something like that. But thank you for reminding me of that, because otherwise I wouldn't have mentioned it. So, yeah. Anybody else? Robert,
David, you were talking about
Chris, yes.
Iron Age huts being mortared, the stone being mortared. A lime mortar is basically made out of lime and pozzolan, such as volcanic ash. So that would have been easy.
I take it from you, Christopher, as an architect, you would know about that. Yes, absolutely. So a relatively simple technology, in other words, to create the mortar. Yeah. Okay, so thank you for clearing me up on that one. Yeah. Robert?
Jump in. Do you happen to know how deep the Straits of Messina are? The sea level during the just before the beginning of the Great Melt at the beginning of the Holocene was about 400 feet at maximum below present day in the Eastern Atlantic. And I wonder how deep is is there a land bridge possible?
Good. That's very interesting, actually. And I meant to mention it and I forgot about it, because the geology of the Straits of Messina is very interesting. I don't have a figure in my head of exactly how deep it is, but I don't think that Sicily was ever connected to the Italian peninsula. There was always water flowing through the Straits of Messina. But the interesting thing about this, and again, I'm no geologist, we need to ask Maggie maybe.
Oh, no.
But geologically, Sicily is part of the African plate, except for the Paleogeology Mountains, which are the very northeastern tip of Sicily. And they are part of the European plate, even though they straddle the Straits of Messina. So it's the same metamorphic rock of the Paleogeology Mountains, which are, it's the same as the Apennine Mountains of Italy. And this is what causes the terrible earthquakes in northeast Sicily, is the two plates, the European plate and the African plate pushing over each other. But it's not as simple as my two hands are making out, because of course it's not just a clean join, it goes like that, and it's also three-dimensional as well. So it's a very complex question of where that plate begins and ends, but the be-all and end-all of it is I think the Straits of Messina always had water in them ever since the time immemorial. So thank you for mentioning that. Anybody else? Wave your hand, shout out.
Damien, this is not a intellectual question like the others have been, but the people in the sickles, what did they eat there? Because if there wasn't much soil, what did they grow, or did they graze, or what did they do for food?
Good question. Well, they would have had simple grains, so things like spelt and so on would have grown. Not necessarily on Pantalica itself, I think in the hinterland beyond Pantalica, if you like, they'd have had to have gone off to do their farming. And then there would have been sheep, bovines, and cattle and so on that would have eaten the crops around about. So there would have been plenty to eat, I think. Kate.
What about water? What about water, though, Damien? How would they get their water?
That's a very good question, Hazel. It must have been from the rivers, because there are no springs on Pantalica itself.
Gosh, it's a long walk.
It's true to say that in prehistoric times, the water level of the river would have been much higher than it is today, and it would have been a much faster flowing river altogether. So I think it must have been river water that they were drinking. I mean, think about it, it wouldn't have been polluted. There would be no source of pollutant that,
Is there any evidence, Damien, of ice or snow on the island during the Ice Age?
No. The Ice Age never got down as far as Sicily. It got down into the middle of Italy, but never any further south.
Damien, since it was difficult for burials, I'm surprised that they didn't resort to cremation.
Well,
not typical.
That's another interesting point, because you remember when I showed you the huts of Cabo Graziano on Filicudi. Now that is part of the Milazzese culture, and in Milazzo, which is the port town for the Aeolian Islands, we have evidence of cremations. And what they did is they cremated the body and then put it in an urn, and we have these urns. So it did absolutely exist in Sicily, but it was particular to certain civilizations, but obviously not the sickles. The sickles preferred burial. So it's an interesting observation. Yeah, thank you. Anybody else? Otherwise, I think we've gone over time, so I think we might have to draw it to a close. But before we close off, I would like to say thank you all for joining us. I hope it's been rewarding, hope it's been enjoyable, and I hope it's been sort of stimulating in some way or another. Have a good week, and please join us again for next week's lecture. Next week's is the last of our lecture series, and we are going to be visiting the beautiful little towns of Sicily, of which, of course, there are many. And I think, personally, I think they are some of the most rewarding places to visit on the whole of the island. So there is a reason why I left it to the last. So please join us then. And in the meantime, look after yourselves. Have a good week. And now, for those of us in England, it's
Lovely. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
thank you.
Bye.
Nice to see you all. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.